The 17th Prime Minister of Australia walked into the ocean in front of witnesses, in broad daylight, in his own country. Within seconds, he was gone. No body was ever found. And what came after, the theories, the cover-ups, the conspiracies, turned one man's death into a mystery that Australia still hasn't fully buried. Most politicians spend their careers trying to look serious. Harold Holt spent his trying to look dangerous. While other Australian prime ministers gave stiff speeches and wore suits to the beach, Holt was being photographed in a scuba mask, surrounded by women in bikinis, styled after James Bond. There was even a comedy album made about him, titled Holt 007. He was 59 years old, the most powerful man in the country, and he genuinely did not care what that looked like. That was the thing about Harold Holt. He had spent 32 years grinding through the lower ranks of Australian politics, waiting, watching, serving under Robert Menzies for over a decade as his loyal deputy. When he finally got to the top in January 1966, he wasn't going to spend it being cautious, and politically, his instincts were sharp. Within months of taking office, he flew to Washington and stood on the White House lawn next to President Lyndon Johnson. What he said there became the most remembered line of his career, all the way with LBJ. He was pledging Australia's full commitment to the Vietnam War, binding his country to America's most controversial military campaign. His critics called it embarrassing. His supporters called it decisive. Either way, later that year he won a landslide election on the back of it. Harold Holt, by any measure, was at the height of his power. But underneath that image, the fearless diver, the bold politician, the man who laughed at risk, there were cracks forming that almost nobody was paying attention to. Holt had been spearfishing since 1954 and considered the ocean his real home. He would unzip his wetsuit mid-dive and stuff live, bleeding fish inside it so he could keep hunting. He was known to hold his breath during parliamentary debates just to pass the time. His press secretary once confronted him about how dangerous his hobby had become, and Holt's response was pure Harold Holt. "What are the odds of a prime minister being drowned or taken by a shark?" He said that in 1967, the same year everything started going wrong. In May of that year, he nearly drowned. Not in some distant sea during a solo adventure. At Cheviot Beach, his own favorite spot near Port C, Victoria. The same beach he had been visiting for years. His diving companions had to drag him to shore. He turned purple. He vomited seawater. He remained conscious, barely, and when asked what had happened, he blamed a leaking snorkel. "That's the closest I've ever been to drowning in my life," he said, and then went back the following week. By September, his body was beginning to betray him more seriously. A shoulder injury from his football days had flared up badly enough that he was put on prescription painkillers and booked for twice-weekly physiotherapy. His personal physician examined him just days before December 17th and gave him a clear instruction: cut back on swimming. Avoid overexertion. Harold Holt heard that advice, nodded, and drove to Cheviot Beach anyway. What nobody in that car knew, not his companions, not his staff, not the people who loved him, was that the beach he described as the back of his hand was about to become the last place he ever stood. December 17th, 1967 started like any other summer weekend for Harold Holt. There was no grand plan, no official schedule. He was at his holiday home in Port C, relaxed, in good spirits by all accounts. A group of friends had gathered: Marjorie Gillespie, her daughter Viner, Viner's boyfriend Martin Simpson, and a man named Alan Stewart. Someone mentioned that a round-the-world sailor was expected to pass through Port Phillip Bay that morning. Holt wanted to catch a glimpse. So they drove down to Cheviot Beach. Familiar ground, an easy decision, the kind of thing you do without thinking twice. What they found when they got there was not a calm summer morning. The tide was at its highest. The surf was described by those present as unlike anything they had seen at that beach before. Martin Simpson waded in and stopped at his knees. The undercurrent alone was enough to drag him off balance. Viner and Marjorie stood back. Even Alan Stewart, who followed Holt into the water, turned around almost immediately. Every single person in that group made the same calculation. This water is too dangerous today. Every person except one. Holt stepped behind a rock outcrop, changed into his blue swim trunks, walked to the waterline, and said the words that would follow him into history. I know this beach like the back of my hand." Then he walked straight in without hesitating, without testing the current, without looking back. He began swimming out immediately, moving away from the shore with the kind of confidence that only comes from decades of believing nothing in the water can touch you. Marjorie Gillespie kept her eyes on him. She watched him swim further out, further than made sense given the conditions, until the water around him seemed to change, the surface churning, disturbed, different. And then he was gone. Not gradually, not struggling and then slipping under. Gone in the way she would describe it afterward. Like a leaf being taken out. She said, "It was so quick and so final. That was it. No cry for help, no signal, no last moment. The ocean simply took him." Within minutes, 3 scuba divers were in the water. They were forced back almost immediately. The undertow was too powerful, the visibility too poor, the current working against everything. Stewart ran for help. Within the hour, helicopters were cutting across the coastline. By sundown, close to 200 people were on the ground and in the water. Army, Navy, Coast Guard, the Marine Board of Victoria, the Department of Air. The most coordinated search in Australian history, assembled in an afternoon looking for one man. They found nothing, not a piece of clothing, not a single trace. The search ran through Christmas, through New Year, and was finally called off on January 5, 1968, 20 days, and still nothing. On the evening of December 18th, just one day after he vanished, the Governor-General Lord Casey made it official. Harold Holt's commission as Prime Minister was terminated. He was presumed dead. 5 days after he disappeared, the world came to Melbourne. President Lyndon Johnson flew in, Prince Charles represented the Queen, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson attended. Thousands of ordinary Australians lined the streets outside St. Paul's Cathedral, standing in the summer heat, mourning a man whose body they would never bury. A memorial service. No coffin, no grave, no answers. Just an empty beach, a churning sea, and a country left asking a question that nobody had prepared an answer for. How does a sitting prime minister simply vanish? And the longer that question went unanswered, the wilder the answers people invented. When a body is never found, the imagination fills the gap. And in Harold Holt's case, the imagination went to some extraordinary places. The first theory to gain serious momentum came just months after the disappearance. A story published in the Sunday Observer in 1968 pointed the finger directly at the CIA. The logic went like this. Holt had publicly committed Australia to Vietnam with his famous "all the way with LBJ" declaration, but privately. According to former colleagues, including Senator Don Chipp and Sir William McMahon, he was having serious doubts. He was reportedly reconsidering Australia's troop commitment. He was asking hard questions about a war that was becoming impossible to defend at home. If Washington found out that their most reliable Pacific ally was about to pull out, and if they decided that couldn't be allowed to happen, then Cheviot Beach on December 17th starts to look less like a tragedy and more like a solution. It's a compelling argument. It collapses almost immediately when you hold it against the facts. Lyndon Johnson personally flew to Melbourne for Holt's memorial. He called him a good and gallant champion. The idea that the CIA eliminated one of their greatest assets in the entire Asia-Pacific region to prevent a policy shift that hadn't even been confirmed, let alone announced, is a stretch the evidence cannot support. Even those who believed Holt was privately reconsidering Vietnam admitted they had no proof he had made any firm decision. A theory built on a rumor about a thought is not much of a theory at all. So attention shifted, and what came next made the CIA story look restrained. In 1983, a British journalist named Anthony Gray published a book called "The Prime Minister Was a Spy." His source was a man named Ronald Titcomb, who claimed that Harold Holt had been recruited as a Chinese government agent in 1929 as a university student in Melbourne. According to Titcomb, Holt had spent the next 4 decades living a double life, rising through Australian politics while feeding cabinet secrets to Beijing, passing documents through dead drops, writing in code, loyal to a communist government while publicly denouncing everything it stood for. And on December 17, 1967, when Holt supposedly feared that Australian intelligence had finally identified him, he didn't drown at Cheviot Beach. He swam out deliberately, was grabbed by Chinese frogmen beneath the surface, guided to the conning tower of a waiting submarine, and disappeared into a new life in Beijing. The book landed like a grenade. Headlines worldwide, television debates. Australians genuinely unsure what to believe. Then the scrutiny began. Holt's biographer Tom Frame examined every claim in the book and described it as a complete fabrication. There was no corroborating evidence for any of the core allegations. None of the documents referenced in the book were ever produced. The waters off Cheviot Beach were later confirmed to be far too shallow for any submarine to operate undetected. Holt was one of the most vocally anti-communist politicians in Australian history, and the substantial payments he supposedly received as a spy were never reflected in his finances, his lifestyle, or any record anyone could find. As for Ronald Titcomb, the man whose testimony the entire book rested on, he was later exposed as, in the words of people who investigated him, a professional con man. Anthony Gray himself, it later emerged, believed that all life on Earth had been genetically engineered by extraterrestrials. Zara Holt, Harold's widow, needed only one sentence to end the debate. Harry? Chinese submarine? He didn't even like Chinese cooking. Every theory that surrounded Harold Holt's disappearance eventually broke against the same wall. The man himself, his actual record, his actual life, and the actual beach where 5 witnesses watched the ocean take him in seconds. The conspiracies were loud, but the sea had already given its answer. The coroner just needed 38 years to make it official. 38 years is a long time to leave a question open. It wasn't until 2005 that the Victorian coroner finally held a formal inquest into Harold Holt's disappearance. The delay wasn't negligence. Under the law, as it stood in 1967, a coroner had no jurisdiction to investigate a death where no body had been recovered. That law changed in 1985, and eventually, the case that had generated more conspiracy theories than almost any other in Australian history got the official examination it had always deserved. State Coroner Graham Johnstone reviewed everything: the police reports, the witness statements, the medical records, the physical conditions at Cheviot Beach on December 17, 1967. And when he delivered his finding, it carried the quiet weight of something that had always been true, but nobody wanted to accept. Harold Holt had drowned, accidentally. His body had been swept out to sea or taken by marine life. There was, in the coroner's own words, nothing of significance in any of the material gathered that would indicate anything other than drowning occurred. Not a spy, not an assassination, not a submarine. A 59-year-old man who trusted the ocean more than the ocean deserved to be trusted. When you lay out everything that was working against Holt that day, the real story becomes less mysterious and far more painful. He was on prescription painkillers for a shoulder injury serious enough to require twice-weekly physiotherapy. His doctor had examined him days earlier and told him directly to stop overexerting himself. He had nearly drowned at that exact beach just 6 months before, turned purple, vomited seawater, been dragged to shore by companions. His family had a history of early death. He was not, despite the image he carefully maintained, a strong surface swimmer. He was a diver, comfortable underwater, but in rough open surf he was as vulnerable as anyone. And yet he walked in without hesitation, without testing the current, without acknowledging for even a moment that the sea does not care who you are. That was Harold Holt's real story. Not the conspiracy, not the Cold War drama, not the submarine. It was the story of a man so convinced of his own invincibility that he ignored every warning his body, his doctors, and the ocean itself had given him. His press secretary had asked him directly about the risks. His answer had been almost prophetic in hindsight. What are the odds of a prime minister being drowned or taken by a shark? As it turned out, higher than he thought. What followed his death has its own strange poetry. The Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Center opened in Melbourne, a swimming pool named after a prime minister who drowned. A second one was built in Vung Tau, Vietnam, the country whose war had defined his political career. A metal plaque was bolted to the ocean floor at Cheviot Beach on the first anniversary of his disappearance, sitting permanently in the water that took him. His name entered Australian slang. Do a Harold Holt, means to vanish without warning, the kind of dark humor that only emerges when a nation has genuinely processed something and found no other way to carry it. The sea never gave him back. It rarely does. But what this case leaves behind, stripped of every theory and dramatic retelling, is something quieter and harder to sit with. 5 people stood on a beach. One of them walked into water that the other 4 refused to enter. And the ocean, indifferent as it has always been to titles and power and certainty, simply kept him. No submarine required.